The marksman begins in Mexico with a child named Miguel. Miguel lives with his mother Rosa, and his father died when he was a baby. One day, as Rosa was cooking at home, she received a call from her cousin Carlos. He informs Rosa that a drug cartel is seeking him after stealing their significant sum of money. As a result, he requested that she take the stolen money and leave Mexico as soon as possible. Carlos was eventually apprehended by the drug cartel, which was run by Mauricio. When Mauricio checks his cell phone, he sees that Carlos has just contacted Rosa. Thinking that Carlos gave the cartel money to Rosa, Mauricio immediately plans to hunt her down. As for Carlos himself, he was killed by Mauricio's men after being beaten. At the American-Mexico border, specifically in the Arizona area, a retired Marine named Jim Hansen is on duty to guard the border from illegal immigrants. While watching his cattle, Jim saw some immigrants who were quietly about to cross. He immediately reported his discovery to other officers before following the immigrants. After a while, he discovered a Mexican man with a wound in his leg. The man was abandoned by his gang because a wound in his leg rendered him unable to move. Jim reported it again to another cop over radio before returning home. Jim arrived at the residence with a bank officer who wanted to collect debts. Jim ended up in a lot of debt after having to pay for his late wife's cancer operations. Worse, if he is unable to pay the bill, his house will be taken. He had no money and had to ask the debt collector for a few extra weeks to pay off his debt. In the afternoon, Jim visited a cattle farmer to sell some of his cows. Unfortunately, the cattle farmer offered his cow for a low price. Jim was perplexed because, even though all of his cows had been sold, he still lacked the funds to pay his debts. That evening, Jim went to the bar to relax for a moment. There, he encounters his stepdaughter, Sarah, a border police officer. Jim then told her about his debt problem, which could force him to lose his home. That night, Jim drank so much that Sarah had to drive him home. The following day, a cartel pursues Rosa and Miguel at the Mexican-American border. They were attempting to enter America via a hole in the iron fence when they encountered Jim, who happened to be passing by. Rosa, now an illegal immigrant, begs Jim not to report her and Miguel to the border headquarters. Shortly after, Mauricio and his group arrived and demanded Jim hand over Rosa and Miguel. Jim decides to protect Rosa and Miguel after realizing their lives are in danger. That obviously enraged Mauricio, and Jim and the cartel got into a battle. Jim shoots one of Mauricio's guys with his weapon before fleeing with Rosa and Miguel in a pickup truck. However, Mauricio refused to let them flee. He tried to catch up with Jim, but Jim eventually managed to flee. After losing his quarry, Mauricio becomes enraged when he discovers his brother, whom Jim shot, has died. From here, Mauricio developed a vendetta toward Jim Hansen. On the other hand, Jim discovers Rosa has been shot. The gunshot wound was bad enough to endanger her life. Rosa, as if recognizing her life was in danger, handed Jim a bag and her family's address in Chicago, pleading with him to take Miguel to his grandmother. Rosa took her final breath after saying everything she could. But that evening, when medical and police officers arrived at the crime scene, Sarah informed Jim that Miguel would be brought to the police station and handed over to his family. The next day, Jim and his dog, Jackson, observed a drug cartel-owned automobile in the parking area at the border crossing. But he didn't appear upset by it. Jim opened the bag Rosa had given him and discovered that it contained a substantial sum of money. Given his debt, Jim immediately drove to the bank to pay it all off. But when he saw Rosa's blood stain on the bag, his apathy crumbled. He recalls being given the job of watching after Miguel, and so he returned to the border office. Jim discovers that Miguel will be turned over to his family, who are waiting outside. However, he soon realized that the family in question was Mauricio. So when the office secretary was on the phone, Jim went to Miguel and took him away quietly. Meanwhile, in the parking lot, Mauricio sees Jim and Miguel leave. He resolved to invade American territory in order to kill them and recover his money. Jim returned home moments later to get some of his clothing and weapons. Then he and Miguel went directly to Chicago. At the same time, Mauricio and his group began crossing the American border. The border police appear to be well aware of the atrocities committed by Mexican drug cartels. Frightened, he let Mauricio and his gang simply enter America. After that, Mauricio headed directly to Jim's residence. He enters the house and discovers Jim's credit card documents and a Marine Award medal, showing that Jim is not an ordinary person. Mauricio then seized the badge and lit Jim's house on fire. Mauricio decides to meet with a cartel member in America to obtain Jim's credit card information. Jim, on the other hand, had stopped at a petrol station to refill and purchase a map to help him navigate his route to Chicago. Unfortunately, he was unaware that Mauricio had tracked him down using the credit card he used at the petrol station. Mauricio and his group rushed to the gas station. When they arrived, Mauricio spoke with the shop clerk about Jim's destination, but the shop assistant was unaware, and she also opposed to Mauricio reviewing the CCD tape. Mauricio, irritated by her conduct, eventually kills her so he may review the film. The camera footage shows Jim heading east. Meanwhile, Jim was stopped by the police and asked to display his driver's license and identification card. Jim admitted that he carried a handgun and a legitimate certificate of ownership. Instead, the police wanted to take his pistol. He also wanted to talk with Miguel. Jim reluctantly followed the officer to his car. Jim quickly realized the cop was filming someone on the phone. He did not speak with Miguel at all. Jim became suspicious and confronted the cop, who verified his concerns. The cartel has hired the cops to locate Miguel. Jim then strikes the cop mercilessly, knocking him unconscious. Jim then advises Miguel to hide before the cartels arrive. Shortly after, Mauricio confronted the cop regarding Jim and Miguel's whereabouts, but the cop didn't know because they left while he was unconscious. When Mauricio heard this, he became enraged and shot the police officer. Unfortunately, Mauricio discovered Jim's map before he departed and took it. With no guns, Jim decided to go to the gun shop and purchase a shotgun, his preferred weapon type. That night, Jim and Miguel stay in a motel and fall asleep immediately. Jim awoke about 2 a.m. and decided to go out and spend the night with Jackson, but he had just exited the room when he noticed Mauricio and his company at the hotel reception area. Jim immediately woke Miguel and contacted the police to report the robbery at the motel. After that, he led Miguel into the bush. Not long later, Mauricio and his crew broke into Jim's room and discovered he was not there. They looked for him throughout the hotel before an enraged Mauricio yells and threatens to kill Jim. After Mauricio departs, Jim instructs Miguel to get into the car while he returns to the hotel to hunt for Jackson. But the time was off because Jim discovered Jackson barking at Mauricio, and the dog was shot dead in front of Jim, shattering his heart. The next day, Jim and Miguel buried Jackson at the property. After that, they went to a church, where Miguel wanted to pray for his deceased mother. The priest who led the prayer then approached Jim and inquired whether Miguel was his grandchild. Jim responded honestly, stating that he was trusted by someone to look after Miguel and had no connection to him at all. Jim then contacted Sarah and demanded that he return Miguel to the police, but he declined since he was determined to take Miguel to see his family in Chicago. They then began their trek, while the cartel struggled to figure out how to apprehend Jim. But at that point, Mauricio and his gang discovered hints on Jim's map. The map displays Chicago, which Miguel had earlier highlighted with a red marker. When Mauricio realized where Jim was going, he immediately summoned a cartel in Chicago to intercept him on the road. Jim and Miguel, exhausted from their trek, relax under the bridge and make a fire to warm themselves. They'd also burnt the cartel's money to keep the flames going. They resumed their trek, eventually arriving in the Chicago area the next day. However, when crossing the highway, Jim noticed a cartel group monitoring him on the flyover. He recognized he was under siege and decided to continue his trek to the countryside to avoid danger. However, Mauricio and his crew have eventually discovered Jim's location. They promptly pursued and intercepted him from the front. Fortunately, Jim dodged again and drove Mauricio's car into the bushes. Jim immediately stepped on the gas away from Mauricio, forcing him and his crew to turn around and chase him. As Jim descended the slope, he decided to halt and shoot the pursuers' automobiles with his gun. Jim, a former Marine sniper, manages to shoot Mauricio's driver, causing his car to overturn on the side of the road. Mauricio and the other 2 members then got out of the automobile. Jim, on the other hand, rushed Miguel to safety right away. They get in a fodder barn near the scene. Jim aimed at the opponent from behind the window. He was able to eliminate one of Mauricio's guys with pinpoint accuracy. Now there are only 2 left. Jim then instructs Miguel to fire a gun from inside the warehouse as a diversion. He then moved to the side of the warehouse, aiming toward Mauricio's guys. The plan was successful. Now only Mauricio remains. But, unexpectedly, Mauricio managed to slip into the warehouse and apprehend Miguel. Then he pointed a gun at Miguel in Jim's presence, causing him to drop his weapon. The devious Mauricio then orders Miguel to shoot Jim. But it turned out that Miguel was smarter. He managed to empty the cartridges before the revolver fired, allowing Jim to leap at Mauricio. The two got into a brawl. Miguel is moved to help Jim after seeing their conflict. He then pointed his revolver at Mauricio. Instead of pleading for compassion, Mauricio challenges Miguel to fire a round at him. Jim didn't want Miguel to be a killer, so he quickly grabbed the gun and shot Mauricio. After that, Jim gave Mauricio two options: die at his hands or commit suicide. Mauricio selected the second option. With their pursuers dead, Jim and Miguel resumed their journey until they arrived at the place Rosa had provided them. Jim instructed Miguel to knock on the door, and when it opened, he was met by his aunt and grandmother. He looked back again, but Jim was gone. At the end of the film, Jim staggers onto the bus. Then he sat in the passenger seat, clutching his stomach, which had been stabbed during the Battle of Morris. Realizing he was gravely harmed, he carefully closed his eyes and leaned backward. This final scene makes us question if Jim has died. What are your thoughts? Regardless of the outcome, this film conveys a moral message to us. We should always strive to implement and retain the trust we earn from others.